What's up, it's Rowan here from Artist Smart Education with the weekly HSC Eco stats update. Now, in this episode, I'm going to be looking at the impact of Middle East oil shocks on Australian inflationary pressures in a cost of living crisis. We're also going to be looking at some data you can use on analysis of RBA monetary policy during COVID, which highlights maybe the RBA didn't do as good as we all think, which will be great for you upgrading your analysis on effectiveness of monetary policy. Finally, we're going to look at some changes that Labor are proposing in terms of how the ACCC will work in evaluating mergers and acquisitions, which will influence competitive market structure, which is critical for micro reform. Let's jump in. If this is your first time, I summarise the key stats and headlines from around the domestic and global economy, giving you the key analysis you need to unlock that Band 6 in the HSC Eco course. So, as a bit of context, it was assumed at some level that maybe the Israel-Hamas conflict would increase oil prices and therefore create cost-push inflationary pressure, imported inflation from overseas. Now, that hasn't happened. That hasn't happened largely because there's been softer demand in China, and at the same time, oil production rates have increased elsewhere. Okay, so in fact, what's happened is we've had the lowest price in terms of national average on unleaded in over 2 years at $1.72 a litre. Now, this is fantastic. But will this remain the same? Well, here's the thing. Iran, okay, is actually the world's 7th largest oil producer. So the concern at the moment is that Iran is getting involved in the conflict, and there is risks that Israel may target oil assets in Iran as part of its response to Iran. Now, the challenge here is that crude prices rose 10% as a result of this fear just recently, okay, their biggest weekly gain in more than a year. So as the conflict intensifies, there is a real risk here that we may see oil prices being elevated. Now, the problem is Treasury has done modelling that shows that a sustained 10% increase, so not huge, of the oil price over a year would add 0.4 percentage points to the inflation rate. So not an immaterial impact on inflation. So we can see how supply shocks globally, particularly with commodities like oil, can then create significant imported inflation for the Australian economy. Now, at the end of the day, if prices were to continue rising even beyond that, and hit $20 increase for a barrel of oil, that's 20 cents a litre at the pump in Australia. So we can see that this would have material impacts for both the government and the RBA's attempts to get inflation down into the target zone. And of course, given that supply side, it's again a supply shock, it's going to make it very difficult for the RBA's monetary policy to control this issue in terms of its impact in the Australian economy. So let's keep moving and look at, speaking of the RBA, some really great sort of analysis on the effectiveness of one of their critical pieces of COVID policy. Now, during COVID, they did obviously, bottom of the barrel sort of, cash rate as low as possible. They did quantitative easing, and alongside that, they did something called a term funding facility. Okay, it was a $188 billion program where they gave money to banks, commercial banks, at ultra low interest rates of 0.1%. Now, the goal of this, what they were hoping to do was they were hoping to support the economy while providing a boost to the small business sector. Okay, so the idea was it was meant to provide essentially cheap cash to the banks to loan the money out to small businesses to keep them afloat during shutdown periods, etc. Now, ultimately, what they saw was that it had no statistically significant effects on credit growth to the small business sector. So in other words, they put all this money out there, $188 billion, right? And it basically had no impact, on credit growth to the sector it was designed to. Now, why not, Well, ultimately, one of the reasons was because businesses got support from elsewhere. They had the $90 billion JobKeeper, and they had $35 billion of cash flow support for employers' schemes from the state governments as well, So there was a lot of other support available for them. They didn't need it as much. On the flip side, though, this money did go somewhere. The banks did utilize it, ultimately. And where it went was on providing fixed rate mortgages for, purchasing homes, right? Whether or not, a home to live in, an upgrade in terms of size, an investment property. And so what that has done is it's caused, first of all, before COVID, 15% of mortgages were on fixed rates. Since COVID, 45%. Right? By mid-2021, we're on fixed rates. Now, the challenge is this caused, one of the factors that has arguably caused house values to soar by more than 20% across the countries, the largest increase since the 1980s. And so this review has now basically conceded that this monetary policy, particularly this term funding facility, contributed to housing price growth over the pandemic period on top of the other COVID-era housing stimulus measures and a shift by many Australians to larger homes and properties with extra rooms. So in other words, they're saying if we factor those in, which would have caused some price growth anyway, this has just added more fuel to the fire, Now, of course, the reason this is very pertinent right now is that we've got a housing affordability issue,
Okay, we've got just major issues in terms of the cost of housing in Australia, and that's become a hugely big part of I guess how do we handle this economically moving forward from arguably a supply constraint issue as well from just the availability of housing supply. So how can you use this? Well, ultimately, I think what you want to be highlighting is that when you're evaluating the effectiveness of monetary policy during different time periods, COVID being one of them, I think you can look at it being less rosy. I think a lot of the time we look at it and go, great, outside of the forward guidance and the RBA saying it was going to be low and then basically switching tack and increasing the cash rate. I think outside of that, I think during COVID period itself, we tend to look at monetary policy to be quite effective. It's really as we transitioned out of COVID, right, that I think a lot of the criticism more emerged around monetary policy. But I think what this shows is you can be more critical about monetary policy even during COVID, because we've got a good example of $188 billion that was meant to go to small businesses that doesn't, ends up going to housing much more so, and then it drives this housing affordability issue that we have today. Now, to boot, on top of it, the scheme also lost the RBA about $9 billion. So it also cost them a fair bit of money in the end. So I think we've got some really great analysis you can use here to just upgrade what you're saying around effectiveness of monetary policy during COVID. Now, the final thing I want to share today is we've talked about in recent weeks the fact that Australia has attempted with our national competition policy to have something called workable competition, right? The mix between having large firms that get economies of scale, so they produce lower costs, but that they're still competing to drive costs down. Now, the reality is, finally, the ACCC, I think if you asked any consumer, they would have told the ACCC this, but the ACCC finally, in prior updates, acknowledged, maybe we don't have the right competition structure in place for the grocery supermarket sector. What a surprise, right? And so as a result, it's led to the ACCC, for example, taking Coles and Woolworths to court over, sort of misleading pricing, which is probably the tip of the iceberg. Now, as a result of this, the Labor government is really looking at what can they do, really to alter, the competition landscape that we have and really give ACCC, I guess, more teeth, right? Because at the end of the day, ACCC is responsible for maintaining, the level of, competition and ensuring competitive market practices occur. So what have they done? They've basically introduced legislation, so it's not passed yet, but it's coming, hopefully, right, which will provide the ACCC with more power. It'll provide a set of thresholds that will be introduced so that companies will need to inform the ACCC of their intention to merge or acquire, and it will be reported on a public register, so it'll become public knowledge, Now, in particular, any merger involving a large business of a turnover over 500 million buying a smaller business with assets or turnover of more than 10 million will need to go through the ACCC to review. Now, the whole point of this is that way the ACCC can identify, what impact will this have on the competitive landscape? Will it worsen the competitive landscape materially in such a way that it's going to, create more inefficiencies and drive price growth rather than, prices to go down? Or actually will this lead to economies of scale here that will be a net positive for the broader Australian economy and for consumers? And so this is not yet here, but note, Australia is one of only 3 nations that does not require compulsory notification of mergers. So, on that sense, we're really quite, compared to sort of the rest of the world, quite far behind. And it's probably not a surprise, therefore, that, our national competition policy needs some tightening as we move forward. So there you have it. Key headlines from around the domestic and global economy at present. For those of you that have the HSC exams and English Paper 1, Paper 2 this week, wish you all the best for it. For those of you just starting the Year 12 course, hopefully you're going to find these super helpful in just upgrading your analysis for your essays, for your short answers, but also keeping you on top of the economy. See you next week.